I'm like, here we are.
Now, progress.
You gave Sandra the what's my thing, the Zoom link and everything.
I did, yes. I managed to get you the real thing.
Well, I think at some point we really need to do Jan's fantastic movie that Sandra was
Yes.
Thank you and good night.
Aging and death. I looked at that and I put it on my to-do list, Jan, and I'm so
Not so
glad
much about aging and the elderly. It is about crazy families and death and grief and saying goodbye. So,
are we talking about the film about your grandmother?
Yeah.
Yes, I read all about that today, and we've got it on our calendar for thanks to Pat for June 7th, I think.
Oh, cool.
Is it on TV?
I've got some of the people who are in it downstairs, which is the reason I can't stay for the entire day.
Yeah.
It's my crazy family is visiting me. But
and Jan, you're invited back next week. Next week we're going to talk about the documentary about film and saving the digitization of film.
Oh, that's exactly what Sandra does. Yeah.
Where is the work that Martin Scorsese has done with the Film Institute, and so that's going to be our documentary for next week.
Okay, great. Which one is it? I'm texting Sandra. Hold on.
Let me find the name of it. Jim, what's the name of your movie for next week? We just watched it last night. Film.
Moon?
No, it's film. Semicolon. Something about the aging. I'll find it.
It's on our list of upcoming.
Are you talking about the trip to the moon?
Yeah. No.
It's with Trip to the Moon, but it's
we're
the living record of our memory.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And does it have the name of the director? Penny, are you reading the printout with
No, I'm simply reading my calendar.
Okay.
Living Record of Our Memories is the name of the film.
Can I ask you folks a question? If we're waiting for...
Sure.
So you've been seeing a lot of movies. So do you have one or two that you would especially recommend?
Thank you and good night.
I wasn't fishing for compliments. I was fishing for movies to watch.
Well, on the probably less well-known movies, we watched The Biggest Little Farm.
Right.
It's a documentary about a farm in LA. And it was a filmmaker and his wife who took over an abandoned and dried up old farm. Does that ring a bell?
No.
And the filmmaker had his film students participate, and they filmed for a couple of years the first time. They had animals delivered, how they put manure around it, when the bumblebees came back. And so his film students helped document it. And the farm itself put a call out there. They do organic farming. And so that was really cool. I think, Colleen, you brought us that.
And that's in Los Angeles?
Yeah, on the greater area, someplace in California.
Moore Park area, I think.
Somebody else throw out there one of their favorite movies.
Wow. So when you say the animals are delivered, you don't mean by Amazon. You mean like they give birth, right?
Somebody pulled up with a pregnant sow.
I'm sure that Amazon. I'm sure Amazon is thinking of getting into that business. No doubt.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the things about, general recommendations is we don't always agree on everything.
Really?
Well, that's the point of the group.
Right.
Kind of. We hope we don't all agree on everything.
Right.
And a lot of it is looking specifically at different categories like music and cinematography and lighting that you don't normally look at. And most of us are just lay people. We're not in the movie business or anything. So it's kind of interesting to look at a movie, even a movie that you're not real crazy about, but you look at it from those different categories, it totally changes how you look at the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we all agreed all the time, half of us would be unnecessary.
Well, we also cover so many genres we started the weekend that COVID lockdown started. So with this iteration of the group, so we've been through a lot. It's been a lot of fun.
Great.
We have, yeah.
Well, now you can all watch movies about fascism, I guess, if you've started with a good one.
I'm bringing.
Do we have any choice?
Because I know that Sandra had told me that she's in a fascism book group. I thought,
wow.
wow,
Really?
do I want to join this book group?
That sounds hilarious.
I have to admit that I certainly would not want to be in a book group that focused on only that. It would make me
Is
too
the
depressed.
study guide written by Stephen Miller?
I don't think it's a how-to. I think it's more like how come.
It's like, what do we do about?
What the fuck can we do about it?
All right.
Oh, we're gonna be watching Persepolis, which is about under theocratic fascism. Oh,
Sandra Schulberg.
Yeah.
Yay.
Hi,
everybody.
Wow.
That's a big group.
I love your film.
Yeah, everybody's very ardent about film restoration and fighting fascism. So welcome. Please meet Jan Grimes. Where's Jan? Jan Oxen. Anyway, please meet Jan Grimes, who is the organizer and running this. And
hi, Jan.
So nice to meet you. I'm such a fan, and I've read a lot about you and the movie and the family, and Ben Ferenz, who I hope you'll talk to us about. And I told Penny, I was a former director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. I've introduced Annie Leibovitz and Doris Kearns Goodwin and spent some time with Desmond Tutu. And I have to remind myself of that because I'm so nervous about meeting and carrying some discussion and questions for Sandra Schulberg. Thank you.
Stop. We're all just pals and comrades.
Well, I guess, yeah.
Wow, I'm surprised Doris Kearns Goodwin didn't just introduce herself because she does everything.
Not everything. I mean, with the fact that Simon and Schuster had to pay off, all of her plagiarism accusations.
That is right. Yeah.
I think plagiarizing her own memoir I think it was because of, an assistant who cribbed a little too liberally from me.
That's right. But
it's always the graduate student's fault.
Well, you should always have an assistant you can blame.
Well, she fessed up. She was pretty open about it once.
Meanwhile, as long as we're talking about nefarious people, I should probably, be silent, and we can talk about the Nazis, or let Jan and Jan talk, because Jan Oxenberg is only here for a limited amount of time.
Okay.
So all I have to say is I'm so grateful that Sandra was able to do this, because I realized that MG invited me to be here today because I am Sandra Schulberg adjacent, just because I know her. But I'm certainly not the best person to talk about this amazing documentary and just the amazing family and story. So, Sandra, thank you so much for joining this group. I really appreciate it.
I'm glad I could do it. I know some of you, but I'm looking forward to getting to know the rest of you. And I don't know if you have questions. How do you want to do this?
Well, I'll tell you first. I've got an agenda, if you wouldn't mind, which I want to respect. Both of the guests to allow them some time to have the floor. But I also, Sandra, had begun to prepare what I think would be a film pitch. Not knowing you were coming, I saw on Canva, the design platform, the way you pitch a movie in Hollywood. And you introduce the team and you talk about the tone in the other similar movies and the plot, blah, blah, blah. So I have some of those elements, and I think you might get a kick out of the 2-minute intro to how I might have pitched your film if you weren't here. And here's the actual source. So when it gets to, so what would you say is the positioning, and what did you do about marketing? Yada, yada, yada. I would love to hit you with some of that, partnership and how you got us here. But before I would do that, I would ask Jan Oxenberg to tell us how she's worked with you. We're fascinated about, the business. And Jan,
the whole idea of
we said to Jan that
yeah.
next week this group is going to watch a documentary called Film, the Recording of Human Memory or something like that. It's a documentary.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar, and the work Martin Scorsese has done, and
it's a little too long, but it's pretty fascinating for, if you want to understand who's trying to do what to save films. I think it's a very illuminating film. Unfortunately, they didn't come to IndieCollect, so we're missing from the picture. But
I was going to say you were shortchanged. It fits so well with this one today, which is why we put them back to back. And you worked with Jan Oxenberg on her 1992 movie to get it restored. So maybe you could give us a look at that.
We restored all three of Jan's films. Thank You and Good Night, Home Movie, her first, and A Comedy and 6 Unnatural Acts. And then we helped secure a deal for her with Criterion, who are going to put it out as one of their collector's edition Blu-rays with additional material that they're going to produce with Jan if she can ever focus on this.
That's wonderful. And Sandra, before we continue, I need to tell you that we are recording for others. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I requested that because I have to go have dinner with my siblings and my cousin, and who surprisingly showed up. So I want to see the rest of but I met Sandra when Sandra started the independent feature project. Sandra has, I think it's really worth focusing on the film and that story, which is more profound than, all of this. But Sandra has made a profound difference in the United States and the world in terms of the way in which independent film exists, and not only is preserved. To preserve it, it first had to get made. So, it was, what was it, like the early 80s? And
it was the late 70s.
Late 70s. I had just I had just shot documentary footage that went into Thank You and Good Night. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it, and Sandra had the idea of consolidating. There wasn't an easy path into mainstream filmmaking at that time, and because of that, I think some really interesting films were made. Like, you wouldn't make a movie about your dying grandmother starring real people, actors, and cardboard cutouts if you were like trying to get a Hollywood career. That's what ended up happening. But, the fact that independent filmmakers who are making, let's say, lesbian or gay films, or even feminist films, or unusual films, at that time, were not welcomed into the mainstream. And so we really, that in a certain way was a gift. And so Sandra, in conjunction with the New York Film Festival, started the first exhibition of independent features. And I got a job as her receptionist. And I was trying to, get odd jobs to make, while I was doing Thank You and Good Night. And so I got to know one of the most extraordinary people that I know in my life, and plus the classiest.
And then American Playhouse, which I joined, ended up putting up a good deal of the backing for Thank You and Good Night. So we then had that was a wonderful outcome of all of this as well.
Yeah, I had a meteoric rise from receptionist to member of the board of directors of the Independent Feature Project because I was a lesbian independent filmmaker, and I think they needed one on their board.
Well, we had a whole bunch. We had Mark Rappaport and
She's not a lesbian, but
true, touche. Oh God,
so I've
Yeah, I
known
know
Sandra for
lesbians and gay men
many
look a lot
years,
alike.
and she's gone. She continues to reinvent the whole landscape of film, really, and because uh, it's just like anything else, the independent film, then others follow behind it, and so
So the
I'm
point
gonna.
is that we decided, no one was going to give us permission. And I know some of you are part of the same effort. We just decided we were going to do it ourselves. And the effort was simply because we tended to be working in silos, just to get all of us in one room and map out how we were going to actually get our films into theaters, even if it meant going directly to the theater owners, because there weren't distribution companies that necessarily wanted to take on the film. So that was a key component of the early days of the IFP, was getting the publicity for our work, but getting the publicity really depended on platforming it. And so we had to go to the theaters. And we also had to bring international buyers into New York to see our films, because some of them had played at Cannes or Berlin or Rotterdam, but very few. And so we started the first IFP market, which really wound up propelling the IFP, far beyond the few years I thought it might take to kind of get our work noticed.
And then companies that, whose names you probably know began to exist, like Miramax and Sony Classics and New Line, and, companies that then and still
Fine
exist.
Line,
Fine
Cinecon,
Line.
Focus, many companies grew up to, and some have gone by the wayside, but yeah, we did make a difference. Although if Bob Redford hadn't come along and started Sundance, he may have started a year or two after focusing on indies after I tried to organize this all, but he had an outsized impact, as you all know. If it hadn't been for Redford's glamour, and his taking over of Sundance, I don't know whether we would have made the strides that we wound up making. So I give him a lot of credit. I mean, on the other hand, the IFP always had to worry about the margins, because if you got picked up by Sundance or some of the distributors, then you were worrying about the next year's crop and who hadn't yet become hip or found an agent or found a distributor. So we were really always nurturing the margins. And IndieCollect, which I now run, is in a way the outcome of all that, because I realized, restoring my father's film about the Nuremberg trial, and that there weren't enough people focused on saving the films of the 60s generation, the films made in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. And that's when I realized, well, if the IFP's not doing it, and Film Independent's not doing it, and AFI's not doing it, and Marty Scorsese's not doing it, then once again, maybe we better try to do this ourselves. So that's been my mission for the last decade. And along the way, because I had restored my father's film, I was approached by Jean-Christophe Klutz, who made the film you, I guess, have all just seen, and asking me if I would allow him to try to tell the story. I had been traveling around the US, going from theater to theater with the help of Jeff Lipsky to get my father's film seen for the first time, because it had been quite effectively suppressed after it was made in the US. And so Jean-Christophe's offer made it possible for me to tell the story on film. And I think, as one of you said, this is such a complex film because it's a film within, there are many films within this film.
The recursion that you mentioned, Jan, that it's a movie about a movie that's all made it's a recursion, a movie about a movie about a movie.
Oh. Yeah. So it's hard. I mean, I love getting into the detail of it, but there's very rarely the opportunity to really dive deeply into it. And
well, I shared with the group a link to the Jewish cinematography. You did an interview with
I watched that.
Jewish Cinema Association of some kind, which is very helpful on how you put it all together.
I'm not sure which interview you're referring to, but I'm glad if it was helpful.
The name of the interviewer again, I just watched it today.
Yeah. I've got to pull it up.
I didn't write his name down, I don't think.
Eric Goldman.
Yes.
Eric Goldman. There have been quite a few interviews.
After I'd like to just jump in, but
yeah, jump in.
After seeing this film a number of times, and it's just such an incredible story. I mean, the confluence of the Jews who created Hollywood, Sandra's family being part of that, and the fact that these people, that the existence of Hollywood and John Ford movies, persuading a Russian general to let them have the evidence that we have of what happened in the Holocaust. I mean, you can't make this shit up, and it's such a profound and great story. And so I was wondering, Sandra, what was left out? Like, are there parts? I'm just curious. I'm going to ask one question before I have to go. Is there a part of the story that couldn't be included in the movie for whatever reason that you think is important for people to know?
Well, one of the things that really fascinates me about the story, and I hope I'm going to not get to write the book that I want to write, but force myself to write the book I want to write.
You get to write it. You just have to write it.
Is that there was just so much. Well, let me go back and first say that the first elements that underlie my father's film about the trial were actual evidentiary films. And this was very innovative, the idea of showing film. The trial was largely based on documents Justice Jackson didn't trust, and many prosecutors don't, witnesses, live testimony, because it can be questioned, and people's memories are faulty, and they can be rattled in the witness chair, and so on. So because there was such a trove of written documents, Jackson wanted very much to base the case on the documents. But the concern was that, and this was proven, proven in the first month of the trial, that reading these documents, which had to also be translated into multiple languages, into the record, proved excruciatingly boring. And at the same time that Jackson felt so strongly about the documentary case, I mean, the documents case, or documents as evidence, he did also feel that it was really important to show film evidence if it could be found, and also to make a film in the courtroom about what was happening, because the courtroom was so small, so few people could get in there as journalists and participants, that he was aware of this, and he was very concerned about it. So the first documents that were shown in the courtroom were they tried to give them the character of evidence. A document, it's generally addressed to someone, and it's signed by someone. And so its context is built into the document to some extent. Whereas if you find a piece of film, you don't necessarily know who shot it, when, for what purpose. And so how do you treat that as, how does that fragment come to have a juridical character? And so what they did was they wrote out affidavits, and they filmed them, and they put them at the head of the two films they showed, the Nazi plan and Nazi concentration camps. And basically what they were saying in these documents is that, I swear that we swear that we have not tampered with the evidence, with the visual representations that you're about to see. And they were signed by John Ford, by Ray Kellogg. One of them is signed by George Stevens, Sr. And so these were their attempt to give these films some juridical validity, if you will. But Jackson's own staff was very skeptical about this whole idea of using film in the courtroom. And one of the fascinating letters I have is my father wrote, as you see in the film. He didn't write them longhand, by the way. They were all typed. That was one of the things that drove me slightly crazy about Jacques-Christophe's mise en scène, is that he was writing pages and pages and pages of letters home to my mom, because they were recently married and he was very much in love. So he was writing voluminous pages all the way through the search for the film evidence and through the trial to her. And I have all those letters. So he wrote on November 9, which was just a couple of weeks before the start of the trial, that Jackson had called up the film unit, because by that time they had offices in the Palace of Justice, where they were madly sort of cutting together the films, and said, a picture is worth 1,000 words. He wanted to congratulate them on their work. And according to my father, he literally said a picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, as you see in the film, showing the films in the courtroom had a devastating effect on the entire atmosphere of the trial. And so, although I would never say, because I know a fair amount about the trial, that the films were somehow, the thing that convinced everyone, I do believe that they had a profound impact on the judges and on the defendants themselves, and of course on the press. Now, having said that, I just want to add that the films that were shown in the courtroom are fragments. One of them is composed entirely of footage shot by British and Russian and American cameramen when they liberated the camp. So it's not the film shot by the Nazis. But the second film they showed, which was much longer, called The Nazi Plan, that's the footage that my father and uncle and the rest of the team found in the 2.5 months leading up to the trial. And again, they didn't always know. I mean, they figured out what it was, but they didn't always know why it had been shot. So my Uncle Bud wrote the intertitles for it just to sort of indicate what they knew about the material. Now you have to step back and you have to put yourself in my father's position, now having to try to tell the story of the trial and using the film footage. And this is where things get very complicated in a way, because he's having to repurpose footage that they assembled in order to create a chronology of the trial. And all filmmakers, all of us, whenever you choose two images and butt them up against each other, you are making an editorial decision. So I'm one of those people who does not believe that even a documentary, let alone a work of fiction, is true or devoid, objectively neutral, devoid of an editorial perspective. So I'm terribly aware as I watch my father's film, and we ran into the same problems making Filmmakers for the Prosecution, that every time you're putting two images together, you're making a statement of some kind. And one of the things that I find so fascinating, which we were not able to get into in the documentary, because it had to be, an hour long, and we wanted to make it much longer, but we shot wonderful, profound interviews with Michael Berenbaum, who is the first, in a sense, designer and curator of the Holocaust Museum, and with Annette Ensdorf, who's one of the world-renowned experts on the cinematography of the Holocaust, and also with Stuart Liebman, who's another scholar of Holocaust cinematography. Only Stuart, a tiny, tiny bit of Stuart's interview got into the film. We didn't have room for Michael Berenbaum or Annette Ensdorf. And their comments about how you know what you're watching, I think the fact that we couldn't get that in there was my biggest disappointment in the documentary. I did manage to persuade Kino Lorber to, I cut like 8 minutes of these 2-hour interviews and persuaded Kino Lorber to include those as part of the extras on the DVD edition of Filmmakers for the Prosecution. So at least if you get the DVD, which I recommend, you can watch those pieces and get a whole other insight into how we should interpret what we're seeing. But I can give you one example that I just find so telling. If you remember, both from my father's film, but we also deal with it in the documentary, there's footage of women SS camp guards throwing bodies into the pit at Bergen-Belsen, and of a bulldozer bulldozing bodies into the pit at Bergen-Belsen. And I think when you see my father's film and Jean-Christophe's, the film that Jean-Christophe and I made, you believe that that was the SS regime, the German regime, handling those bodies that way. But what if I told you, no, they were bulldozing those bodies and throwing them into the pit because the camp had been liberated by the British Army, and they were working under the direction of the British Army when they did that.
Oh,
Does that change how you experience those images?
yes.
Yeah. When I showed the film, just as an example, to the Fordham Law School students, and we watched the film, and then I explained this. They were utterly shocked. It had not occurred to them for a second that this might not have been German footage shot while the Germans were still running Bergen-Belsen. And it changed completely how doubts are raised, and that's what I think is so important to understand, is that what perspective is the filmmaker presenting, and how does that change your perspective on what you're receiving?
Thank you for mentioning that statement you made about the pits and the bulldozer. It's the thing I most remember from an interview with you that I previously saw. And I was going to take you there. But I also really appreciate hearing about the affidavits showed at the front of them. We've got several historians on today. One of them, Catherine O'Connor, we work for the Historic Preservation Agency, both of us. And we have an oral history program there. And Statecraft has interviewed governors, and I interviewed somebody about the failure of EPA, the women's rights to pass in Illinois, blah, blah, blah. But what we found with oral history, okay, the governor himself is being interviewed, former Governor Jim Thompson, and he's saying things incorrectly. So the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Oral History Project has posted them, but has had to put corrections, because what is fact? What is memory? You mentioned that in this case, a film of the governor during that time would have been more accurate than him telling us later. So as historians, Catherine, you could jump in on this, the idea of what is fact, where did it come from, even if you got it on the newspaper, is that real or not? It goes back to the importance of film. The other person, several other people kind of touch on many of the things you've said. My husband, Jim, has been involved with Illinois cameras in the courts. And simply having the camera there, how does that change, especially a witness speaking? So we've got that issue, which you mentioned. Not only was this the first time, as I understand it, that film was used in a court, but also to get a camera present. And I know your dad had limited, or those that were filming had limited time in which they could even run their cameras. So we've got that issue. One of the people that is with us tonight is an Emmy-winning documentarian herself, and has also dealt with what do you choose to show and what have you not shown. Sometimes you don't have room for it, and sometimes maybe it would change your story. What should you do about that? We also have on with us someone involved with the Phil Donahue Show, and allowing people to speak. And even if they're speaking, is it mush? And how do you deal with that? Who else? We've got Bob Ladendorf, who has been pushing us hard with every movie or documentary. How do you know? What's factual? Is it okay? Historical fiction, is it based on a true story, or just reminiscent of a true story? How do you even deal with that? And yeah, and so is it a good time to throw it open, or do you have other things or did we lose the other Jan? Yeah. Oh, no, we've got Jan.
Oh, she's there.
Before I throw it open, Sandra or Jan, something else, or should we play with this topic a little?
Well, I would just say that, we're wrestling with this at the claims conference, because I sit on the panel that gives grants for films about the Holocaust, and we get fascinating proposals, but sometimes there are errors, and we see those errors sometimes, or misappropriations, in the rough cuts or samples, and we try to communicate that back. As a panel, we discuss this, and then the program officers try to communicate that back to the filmmakers. One of the things that we talk about is in a serious book, you have footnotes either at the bottom of a page or at the end of a chapter. And that is such a wonderful way to cite your sources and help the reader understand what you've taken out of context but feel belongs in the book. But as filmmakers, we don't have that opportunity. I mean, imagine if we footnoted every piece of archival footage, let's say in a film. I mean, it would be impossible. But part of me, now that I have dealt with so much misappropriation, and been guilty of it, not unintentionally, intentionally, because there wasn't the footage available. So you substitute other footage. And I just wish that we could find a way to annotate our films so that the viewer would understand what choices we've made.
Well,
So
can I just
I'll shut up now?
No, I want to ask another question before I go, because, when you talk about, okay, that was the British people, bulldozing bodies, it's not like the Nazis didn't do things as horrible or more horrible. It's not, it's like focusing on the fact that that happened to be the British after the liberation really doesn't, almost distracts from the reality. In my opinion, I mean, it's, I was in Poland recently, they have a museum on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. You go through 1,000 years of the history of Jews in Poland, where the Polish people want you to know that the Jews had it pretty good in Poland for a while, but, not at the end. So you get to the part finally about the Warsaw Ghetto, and they have these movies finally that the Nazis took of the Polish people watching the Jews being herded onto the cattle cars. And, so what if that particular scene was, was like, yeah, that's all.
Well, I think what people have to understand and what I try to explain is that, there was so much disease that they really had no choice but to bury the bodies as fast as possible. And so it looks horrific, and it is horrific, but it was part of the effort to save those who were still alive. And you're absolutely right, Jan, that it's nothing compared to what was done by the Nazis and their collaborators at all the camps. I raised it only because it makes us stop to think about the way we perceive archival footage and the importance of understanding the context. That was really my point. And it's something that I think bedevils every filmmaker, every documentary filmmaker anyway.
I had the same reaction Jan did. And then one more piece of that is a way to look at it is there was so much overwhelming death that they created that they couldn't even get it done quickly enough in real time, so that there was so much left over that for the Americans to do, even though the death machines themselves had stopped. Sure. And my perspective, by the way, is from a family of Holocaust survivors. And the most famous one is Abraham Bamba in Shoah. So there's an example of where oral history, he's describing what happened so many times over and over that it would be quite reliable, as opposed to lots of oral history probably isn't reliable. And a lot of what is in the newspaper isn't reliable.
Well, I mean, the considerations too with deep fakes and Photoshop now. I mean, the authority of a photo-driven documentary is more questioned now with techniques. It isn't even the absence of endnotes, it's the veracity of the material.
I will, if I could jump in as a journalist for one sec, and just say that the one thing journalists always come to things with a perspective, and they do get things wrong, but they work harder than most at a good publication. I'm not talking about Fox News or Newsmax. I'm talking about the Times or NPR or something. They work harder than most to double check the facts. And when they make a mistake, they put in corrections. So as a source, often for documentary filmmakers or for scholars, I mean, I know that my work has been cited in many instances, and in working, I was always deeply aware of why that was so important. And I think most good journalists try,
I wasn't
despite
to
being human.
accuse you, but just so, for example, at the LA Times, my partner for a long time before he died was the pop music critic. And he wrote in a famous letter to the Times after he left, criticizing the younger ones who were saying that this kind of music had never been created before. And he wrote in saying, you didn't look, because in fact, I've written about this. So I'm just saying, I know, and I was just reading the other day polls about how Harris did, and happened to be the Jewish community. And the poll numbers were just so strikingly different. So early
Poll
on,
numbers from different pollsters,
yeah, they
yes,
were
are different,
so
but the
different.
journalist is going to report to you, right?
Right.
This came from X poll, this came from another. And as for the younger journalists, yeah, they made a mistake, and I'm glad he wrote in. I would never, never, never proclaim that everything we do would be correct. I'm only saying they try harder than most. Your
Right.
husband being a
I
very
was
good
only saying
example.
that no matter how hard they try, there's still, you have to do a lot of checking. So these polls, got carried away, the rabbit hole thing, and the ones who cited 79% of the Jewish vote went to Harris. They didn't
Let's
refer to
give
the earlier
Alexis.
Yeah, I
polls.
don't want to go down this. I was just pointing something out in terms of source material for this kind of stuff, and I have no doubt that probably Sandra, in the making of that film, probably some journalism was source material, because if it comes from a good publication, it does tend to be a good source for that. That's all. That's all
Let's
I was
hear
saying.
from a couple other journalists, Alexis and then Penny and Catherine, if you wanted to join in. But Alexis first.
I had a question for you, Sandra, because one of the most difficult things is to sit in a control room. I have not worked in film. I was in video and digital. But as a documentarian, one of the most excruciating experiences going in is, how do you decide what not to keep? So I was curious to know how you make those decisions. What do you do as far as the challenges of what you'd really like to put in, but you don't? How do you make your decisions? I'm curious.
Sandra, you're on mute.
Mute.
There we go. Well, with this particular film, unfortunately, because of COVID, I was unable to go to France to sit in the editing room with Jean-Christophe. And therefore, I was presented with something of a fait accompli. When I made the American version of the film, I was able to correct a few factual errors, which was great. And I was able to, I redid the narration, but there was nothing to be done about what was about, the fact that he photographed someone's handwriting, my father's letters with a quill pen, and my father did use a quill, but not for writing these letters from Germany. And as I said earlier, it was just impossible. And I think even if I'd been sitting in the editing room, we realized that the interventions of Annette Insdorf and Michael Berenbaum were kind of a whole other chapter of the story. And as you know, as filmmakers, it's a pretty brutal form. If you have a set time limit, or even if you don't, it's how many plot lines can you handle? It's a brutal form, and that's why I want to write the book, because there are just so many aspects of this story that are so much more complex and nuanced. And when you are forced to make a film, it all gets truncated. Now, I do think Jean-Christophe did a pretty fantastic job of encapsulating this quite complex story. What he did manage, the through line that he did manage to create, I think is pretty amazing. But of course, I'm aware of how much more there was to tell. And so a lot got left on the floor. It's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm. All the more reason, the footnotes we're hearing from people, all the more reason to write the book.
Thank you.
There's a couple people in the footnotes made that comment, Jim and Bob.
Yeah. If we have them.
Yeah, Sandra, first of all, I agree with your decision to clarify the facts, because particularly in a film like this, which is all about the facts and history and trying to teach people, what not to do in the future, which unfortunately isn't the way it's going. But so, even though there certainly were, the atrocities that, that Francine and Jan mentioned, I think the fact that you specified that this was the British, I just think that was an important thing to do. And in I agree. The book, I think the book would be fascinating. And normally I'm not somebody who says, gee, that movie was too short. For me, it was too short.
Yeah.
It really was. It opened up so many things. I said, yeah, but what about, I mean, there were just so many more things that I would have loved to have known. And I really thank you for doing this thing, because it was, I just thought it was heartbreaking and breathtaking.
Yes.
The other thing that frustrated me is that Jean-Christophe chose to make my father and my uncle the heroes of the story. And while they are, it meant that, and because they're the only ones of the unit that really left behind documentation, it becomes hard to tell this story without relying on their writing, their letters, their accounts. But it's a shame that other members of the team, that we couldn't focus on other members of the team, including this one very young German assistant cutter who they picked up at UFA, the Berlin film studio, to help them, and they brought her to Nuremberg. And I was lucky enough to interview her just before she died. And, she talked about how Ray Kellogg, who was really, because John Ford didn't come he was their commander, but he didn't come for any of this to Germany. So his number two was Ray Kellogg, who had been at 20th Century Fox and went back to Fox after the trial. And Lisa Lotte told me that she was, they would eat together. At their barracks, and she was sitting with them at a meal, and other Americans who were also in the same, dining area said they didn't want her sitting at the table with them. And Kellogg stood up for her and said, she got up to leave. And Kellogg said, "You sit here, you belong with us. You're part of our." And I think one of the things that, that I feel very fortunate about is that my father, who went on to become a denazification film officer for military government after he made the film about the Nuremberg trial, was one of the people who was charged with deciding who had been a Nazi, who had been a collaborator, who had been passive, who had been a resistor. And those were very, very difficult decisions to make. But the result of that is that I came into a family where he and my mother, because she was allowed to join him in Berlin in the fall of 1947, were embracing Germans. There was very little food and no gas and no coal for heating, but my parents were on the PX system, so they had food and they had gas and they had coal and they had clothing, and they would my mother would drive up and down the Kudam and other avenues just giving people lifts, and they had 10, 12 people at the dinner table every night because they felt so obligated to try to do what they could. And they ended up forming very close friendships with a lot of the Germans they came to know. Now, they were mostly Germans who had been anti-Hitler, but I think there were plenty of people they helped and allowed to sit at their table who were just ordinary, who had just tried to keep their heads low. And so I grew up because we, learning German and French. I was conceived in Berlin and born in Paris, and then we moved back to Germany. Whereas Bud, who left they both left right before the trial, but then my father was brought back to make the film about the trial and ended up spending 10 years in Europe. My uncle Bud was just the opposite. He didn't stay long enough to, all he absorbed was a hatred of all Germans, and he never understood how my father could have formed friendships with Germans. So this was something that I saw play out in my own, in my own family, and I'm just grateful that my father, learned to read those nuances and was much more embracing, because I think that his efforts, there's a tremendous amount of debate as to whether the whole denazification effort had any impact at all. One of the people I interviewed at length was an extraordinary man who became, after he was also a denazification officer, film officer in Germany. And then he went to the National Archives, where he became our preeminent World War II expert at the National Archives. And he said to me, 1/3 of the people we touched and talked to and tried to persuade were absolutely unreachable. 1/3 were anti-Nazi to begin with and had either resisted or just tried to save themselves without compromising themselves. He said, but about 1/3 were people who were kind of in this area where they had been pro-Nazi, but they were persuadable. And he said, I think we did have an impact on those people. So by impact, I mean they used film, they created new newspapers, they got rid of all of the people who were pro-Nazi preachers in the various churches, whether Catholic or Protestant. All of the in the school systems, they introduced courses there's a very interesting film called Speak Up, which is about teaching. They felt, and a lot of the films they made were aimed at young people because they kind of wrote off the parents, but they felt that the young people they could reach. And one of the films is called Speak Up, and it's about teaching teenagers to debate with each other, to disagree with each other. Because, of course, any form, and we're seeing this now, but any form of debate or freedom of speech, intellectual resistance, the articulation of countervailing attitudes and ideas was verboten. And you had to teach that again. And it was very, very, very interesting for me to see how they conducted this and then how they made a film about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the last thing I would say is that, you know, my father's film about the trial is not just, and here we get into the whole question of what is propaganda and what is propaganda for good or propaganda for democracy, quote unquote. How the trial, how the 4 counts of the indictment were structured and how the evidence was presented, and the fact that there was defense counsel, which we paid for so that the Germans had pretty high quality defense lawyers. So, you know, this idea that there's something sacrosanct about the structure of a trial itself. But the film also was meant to operate as you can either call it propaganda, or the more polite and somewhat soft power term is public diplomacy. So it was also intended as an instrument of public diplomacy. And when they showed the film in Germany, they were very afraid how it would be received. And the poster, the first poster, was quite telling because it says it says Nuremberg, you know, it's lesson for today. But then the subtitle is, you know, the path to socialism and your leaders, or your leaders and their path to socialism. So it's almost by saying your leaders, ihre Führer, it's inviting the German audience to come in, maybe out of a sense of nostalgia, to think, oh, we're going to see our leaders. To try to entice them, because unlike this earlier film called Hunger, which Germans were forced to see, that my father made, Todesmillen, death mills, that German audiences were forced to see, because if they didn't, you had to have your ration card punched to prove that you'd seen the film, or you couldn't get your rations. So but unlike that, with that film, which produced tremendous resentment, I mean, the Germans were really angry about this, about being force-fed this film that showed what was going on in the camps. So with Nuremberg, they took a different approach. They played it as a normal movie, and people were not forced to see it. So they had to kind of invite people in. And they were very, very, very worried about how people would react, and very curious how they would react. And in my father's papers, I found speaking of polls, the first poll that they took of the audiences in Stuttgart, where it had premiered. So what they did was that they had their German-speaking staffers follow audience members home. You know, people couldn't drive. There wasn't enough gas. People didn't have cars, but they could walk or take a tram to get where they were going. And they would follow them surreptitiously and eavesdrop on their conversations, and then run back to the office and transmit what they had heard. And these polls are just fascinating, because you see a huge range of responses. You hear people people say, why are they dragging us through this? You know, the war is over. It's time to just move on. We shouldn't have to have our noses rubbed in this story of the trial. Other people said, Germans are not ready for this. You know, I'm glad I saw the film, but Germans are not ready for this. This film is being made way too early. People aren't going to go see it. Other people said, well, now I really understand what happened, and it's a good thing this film was made. Some people said, this is nothing but propaganda. I don't believe a word that I've just seen. This is just another attempt to, blacken the reputation of the people that were trying to save Germany. And some people said, how on earth could they put the Russians up there to judge us when we know what crimes they were guilty of? So you see this just amazing, amazing panoply of responses in just the first week of the film screenings. So that was pretty fascinating. The film went on to be shown very widely in what we now call Western Germany, in the US zone. And eventually they felt that it had, and my father wrote in one of his articles about this, that it broke box office records, so quote unquote. So they did get people to show up to see the film. There was a curiosity factor, even though I think it engendered very mixed feelings amongst the members of the public. The Germans went on to, we conducted 12 more trials in Germany, in Nuremberg, in the same Palace of Justice, without the French and the Russians and the British, just the Americans. Those 12 trials, the first trial that my father's film is about is called the International Military Tribunal. The 12 subsequent trials are called the Nuremberg Military Tribunals because they weren't international. They were run by not Justice Jackson, who went back to the Supreme Court, but General Telford Taylor, who became Ben Ferentz's law partner after they both went back to the United States. They formed a law firm together. Didn't do terribly well. But Ben's trial, Ben Ferentz was the one who prosecuted the SS, the trial of the SS leaders. And that was an extremely important trial because they were the ones guilty, and he had the proof, he had the numbers, and he also had testimony of SS leaders acknowledging what they had done. So it was a very powerful and important trial, one of the subsequent 12. Yes, Ellen, what were you going to say?
Correct? The Einsatzgruppen. Penny, did you want to follow up?
The Einsatzgruppen, yes.
I wanted to know if your film is being shown in schools at all. Has there been a push to show this film?
Same question here.
Well, I don't really know. I'm so busy running IndieCollect that I've been a very bad, Kino Lorber has a very strong educational wing, but I have not been good about following this. I just sort of put it in their hands, and they're not reporting to me. So I really don't know. It's a very, very good question. I'm going to ask them.
Yeah, I really think it should be. And I don't know how long it's going to take you to write the book, but it would be such a great combination of sources. We need this now because there's so many deniers out there. Right here at Northwestern, we've got a famous denier.
Eileen,
have you seen the recent Pew poll showing that 50% of people under 30 don't know the Holocaust happened?
They don't.
50%.
They don't know it.
But let's go to those.
It's the Pew Research poll, and it was 25% are certain it did not happen, and 25% are unsure. So that's one of the reasons it'd be really important to have your movie. It would be really important to try and get that in. So there's a bill to require Holocaust education. It's in process. It just got out of Education Committee.
Okay, let's use our hands.
California, that would be helpful.
Let's use our hands if we have something to say.
I know
Eileen is next, and then MG. Go ahead. And Bob.
Bob.
Eileen, MG, Bob.
Eileen?
I am absolutely spellbound, Sandra, by your comments and about having seen the film. I'm more concerned if this film has been banned in schools as being too woke for children. But I do know that my sister, Maureen, has taught her whole career in a school in New York. The name of the town is Jericho, and at that time it was maybe 90% Jewish people, and that's the school where she taught. And I know her school, and my sister did a lot to make sure that the Holocaust was part of the curriculum. I think it's part of the New York State education curriculum, but that's the only one I can speak of exactly. But I really wonder, Francine, about that statistic. That's really high. I think I don't know what that poll was that you referred to, but it seemed to me
they
that
took it in Mississippi and Alabama.
It was?
No, Pew Research is a really respected organization for polling.
I don't doubt it, but I'm talking about the people who answered, because it would seem to me that it would be hard to tell whether those who answered actually had stayed awake for the film or had cut school or had and when they say they didn't see it, it probably that's not enough to ask them, in my opinion.
Well, I don't think she's talking about this film. She's talking about Holocaust
in general. Yes.
In general.
Yeah.
Right. They think that 50% don't know that the Holocaust happened.
Okay,
I was actually at the since you brought it up, I was at the education at the session where there was lobbying to get Holocaust education into California.
Yes, it's in Illinois. Francine, I really want to keep going around the room. And Illinois requires public schools and high schools to have a unit on the Holocaust. MG, and then
they don't hear.
Alice is probably the most banned book in the country. Because of that section about the suicide of his mother. That's not where the characters are not drawn as anthropomorphic animals. But that's shocking, and that's something I teach in my graphic novel course where we showed your film. My question though was when you started pulling this material together, I get the sense from the film that finding the documents that existed and you didn't even know were there was very personal. Did you decide to put it together like during the first Trump administration, or how did that play out, the making of this movie and everything coming together against the landscape of the U.S. political situation and the ascendancy of fascism? Why be oblique?
Well, no, this all predated Trump. I started, I first saw my father's film in 2003. He apparently showed it to my youngest brother's 6th grade class, and we had a print sitting, as I say in the film, print sitting in the 16 print. The film was 35, but we were very involved with my father's career, but it was always about what he was doing then. And I didn't ask him about, that's a mistake we shouldn't make. You should always talk to your parents about what they did before you arrived on the scene, because you learn a lot. So this all predated, I decided as I began to assemble all the documents and and invited a couple of outside scholars to look at them to help me understand if they were unique or important. I little bit, and then I learned about the suppression of the film. So I decided around 2004 that I had to raise the money to restore the film. And that was a 5-year process that culminated with the world premiere of the restoration in 2009 in The Hague in honor of Ben Ferencz, who was getting the Erasmus Prize, which is sort of the, like, I don't know, like the Nobel for peace work. And then it took me another 5 years to develop the Blu-ray DVD edition, and Kino Lorber has some of the Blu-ray editions available. That has a 130-page book with it, and the affidavits are in there. My article, Filmmakers for the Prosecution, is in that booklet. That became the basis for the film that Jean-Christophe decided to make. And there's also, I also shot 14 interviews, which is on this Blu-ray edition, with Ben Ferencz and many, many other leaders in the world of international criminal justice, to try to, what I called, make a Nuremberg archive in a box. So there's about 15 hours of material on that, in that Blu-ray edition. But I only have a few copies left. Kino Lorber bought, 100 remaining copies for me. And I believe you can order them from Kino Lorber, but there are not very many copies left. And if you're serious about studying not just Nuremberg trial, but also all of the materials that were assembled, audiovisual materials that were assembled for the trial, including the films the Russians presented in the courtroom, I strongly recommend that you get that edition, because that has all the context, all the additional material that is really as I said, a Nuremberg trial archive in a box.
Does that also include the American edition of the film with your edits?
No, this was, I'm talking about my father's that I restored. Yeah. Kino Lorber put out a separate DVD only that is my father's restored film and the new film. But that doesn't have the booklet or all those 14 other interviews and all the 8 evidentiary, the 4 evidentiary films and the films that were made before and after the trial. So no, that is a separate, that was all done before Jean-Christophe ever proposed that we make the new, what I call the new film, that has a copyright of 2023.
So could you repeat the name of the one that you recommend we look at that has all these things in it? Could you just repeat that?
You can get the Kino
Lorber edition. It's Nuremberg, it's Lesson for Today.
Oh, okay.
That's my father's film, but it's the edition. They only have a few copies, and I'm not sure they're advertising on the website, but if you call them, they have a limited number of these editions, which have the booklet and all the other interviews and all the other 8 films, but not the new film, because this was all made 10 years before Jean-Christophe and I made the new film.
Got it.
Got it.
So Bob, yes, you had what did you want to say?
You talking about Allert?
Jim. Was it Jim?
No, it was Bob Ladendorf. Bob Ladendorf was next in line, Jim.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Kudos, Sandra, for making us aware of the importance of what your Bud did for the trial, because I wasn't aware of how important that those films were for that. So thank you very much for doing that. One question I had was, you include in there a couple instances of where the Germans were apparently burning the films, one in a cave and another one elsewhere. Were you aware of any other instances of where they were burning, or are those just the two that you were aware of?
Well, those are the only two that Bud discussed and that I learned about from him. And there's still, the circumstances of both of these fires is still very, very mysterious. So in the film, you hear, Klaus Zoller say he thinks it's clearly evidence of sabotage, but no one really knows whether. I mean, they claimed they were accidents, especially the second fire at Rüdersdorf, but it's hard to know.
Thank you. The second question I had was Stanley Kramer's Judgment at Nuremberg feature. Do you know what part of those trials that was? Because that wasn't the one that Bud dealt with, right? Or was it?
No, that's the trial of the judges and lawyers, which was one of the 12 subsequent trials. I think it's 9th of the trials. And they did use footage that Bud and Stuart, that the OSS team collected and showed in the courtroom as footage in Judgment at Nuremberg. But that's not about the international trial.
Okay.
I think that film had a major impact, though. People didn't really, the two things that kind of woke Americans up to what had happened and to some extent the trial, but I'm just talking about the Holocaust, were the Eichmann trial, which is when the word Holocaust was first used as a translation of Shoah, and then the same year, Judgment at Nuremberg. So suddenly, because during the 50s, people weren't talking, and there was not, I mean, there was Elie Wiesel's book, there was Night and Fog, there was what's the Italian writer's name who was at Auschwitz? But there wasn't, yes, Primo Levi. But this wasn't really part of public consciousness until we didn't have television, so the Nuremberg trials weren't televised, and all you got was, my father's film was suppressed. There was a spread in Life magazine that after the verdicts in the first trial, there was a tiny bit of newsreel coverage, but basically people were not aware of the Nuremberg trials at the time. Very, very unaware. But then with the advent of television and the Eichmann trial being televised, now suddenly the whole world is in that courtroom. And that, I think, is the transitional moment when the concept of the Holocaust, the term, but also the experience and people starting to talk about it takes place.
Yeah, Judgment, the feature I think was 1960 and the Eichmann trial 61, if I remember. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think so.
Thank you.
Jim?
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments, Sandra, and thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thanks to your father and uncle for getting cameras in the courts. I had an opportunity to help get cameras for the News Broadcasters Committee in our trial courts here in Illinois. We were about the 35th state to do that, and had to overcome a lot of, will people act to the camera? And the results have been they don't even know it's there anymore. Unfortunately, there aren't as many reporters anymore covering the courts, and that's a problem. The other thing I wanted to mention, as a instructor in the media currently, and Alexis also teaches, we're at Loyola and she's at some other colleges now. we are asked to teach critical thinking and critical news consumption in all our classes, regardless of what the curriculum is. And of course, I'm in the media, so that's natural. But even in our speech classes, deep fakes, how to find that, because that's going to be the next generation. And I appreciate your comments about how to frame the different shots so that it's accurate as much as any perception by a human can be, but it's not misleading. And that's an important part of that. Just because we teach it, however, and I think this speaks to Francine's concern, doesn't mean people learn it or will remember it, because we all knew Lincoln and Washington, but if you do a survey, 30% will get them in the wrong order, and that's the human condition, I think. The last thing, though, and I think your film and your father and uncle's films and so many of the others are so valuable today when we're facing challenges to our democracy and the economy and everything else, is what will we do? Where will we fall between that love it, do more, we're tired of the old system. I have friends who are there that I try to engage. And that seems to be one of the lessons from your films and others, is you have to keep talking to those people. And I was glad to hear about Speak Up. I know the Army, I did Army public affairs for a long time and produced a lot of films, and some of it was more propaganda than fact. It had an agenda, but it's important to do that engagement with our fellow citizens so we don't go off the deep end any more than we already have. So thank you so much for all your work.
I'd be interested to know what films you made.
We did.
Public,
Yeah, we made mostly for the Illinois Guard on what troops were doing in Central America or Germany and around the state, usually humanitarian or medical or that kind of stuff, but also training. And I have to say, when we were in Germany, it was one of the few countries where people genuinely wanted us to be there. This was during the height of the Cold War, before the wall came down, and everything's in a context. Why did the older German people come up and shake our hands? Thank you for being here. And if you'd asked them, they say, well, because we don't want the Russians here, was the interesting reality for them. So thank you.
Well, I encourage you to look back at your own work and write about it, because I think these are the same challenges. These are the interesting challenges. I became fascinated by, even if you're making a commissioned film or propaganda is a very loaded word, but a film that has a message. The filmmaker also has his or her own way of approaching that. And that tension between the job you're being hired to do and how you put yourself into it, either to reinforce or counteract or subtly frame the message, I find those things really fascinating.
Thank you. Catherine, our historian and journalist.
Yes, Sandra, thank you for being here. And I wanted to pick up on exactly what you were talking about, the fluidity between filmmaker, historian, a filmmaker who becomes a historian, and now is becoming the filmmaker. That fluidity of going back and forth, the common denominator being both are storytellers, because what you've done by collecting all that documentary information, all those artifacts together, is so valuable as a research tool. Then the journalist, the historian, the documentarian will glean from that, interpret those things into their story. So both the filmmaker, when you talked about which two images to put together, or the journalist or historian, which two words to even pair together, that is that art. There's the art of the storytelling. And that's what brings it off the page or into the movie theater or whatever, to be able to, make it something we could relate to, that it has to be something relatable. And I understand where you're coming from. Also, when we talk about, as a journalist or historian, we say, I am going to write or interpret a very unbiased story about, I'm going to do this in an unbiased way. But what we learn is that all of us come to all of our work with a perspective. And so instead of trying to claim, oh no, it's very unbiased, it's better to say, to announce who you are, not in so many words. Obviously, when Catherine writes a story, she's coming to it with her perspective, her life's experiences. If I write about, even when I'm doing reporting, you might say, my perspective is still going to color what I choose to put in, and unfortunately what we leave out. And when you talked about, you have only so many minutes and you have to make those selections, and it's the same situation we find ourselves in when we have 1,200 words. Right. And we have a word budget, and then we have the cutting room floor. Yeah. And it makes you want to do more with that stuff. The other point I would make is, as historians, we find ourselves often wanting to tell the story, and then we want to wait, I want to tell a little bit of the context of what led up to this, and a little bit about what led up to that. And we find ourselves in graduate school and a professor saying, look, you can't start with first there was Adam and Eve. There's just, you can't do that. You gotta frame your thing. You gotta figure out where your boundaries are. And it's always very difficult because, as a storyteller, you want it all to make sense. And it can make more sense when we know the origins of how we got there. So, but I'm very happy to say what you've created with your film and what your father created with his film are actual artifacts that now have earned their own historic significance as historic artifacts of their time when they were made. So it's about history, and it has become history now also. Yeah. So thank you for sharing and coming to see us today. It's been very, very enlightening.
Thank you for being so eloquent about all that. Yeah. Roberta, you had your hand up. What did you want to say?
Oh, I'd like to shift the discussion a little bit. You kind of gave us a flavor of your early life. I'm always curious about people who go into the family business. And I'm wondering I'd like to follow a little bit about your career. How did you get where you are? And what did you originally think you were going to do what Dad did? Or did you go another direction? This is, of course, a totally different thing. And by the way, thank you so much for sharing so much tonight.
You're welcome. I really admire so much people who don't follow in their parents' footsteps, who carve out their own paths. I did think I was going to maybe be an academic. I was sort of being groomed for that, but then I got to Swarthmore College and I was just miserable because the dining table at home was so much more interesting. My father's work was so much more interesting. Of course, now I'd love to go back to Swarthmore, go back to college. It was really wasted on me. And so, so the first job I got was in public access, the early days of public access cable. And I went on to essentially follow in my father's footsteps. I mean, I didn't, because I started out in journalism, television journalism, and then I was hired by a remarkable woman, producer Barbara Schultz, to be the story editor for a PBS, a new drama series called Visions. And that was based here in California, where my father had, hoped I'd never set foot. And so I came out here and we began to make very, very interesting original independent movies, actually, that were meant to go on public television. And so that became my career. Looking back, I don't have any regrets. It's been a very interesting mission to be really focused on trying to make independent work and then save independent work and support artists who are not the ones being offered, millions and millions of dollars to make their work. So it's been a very difficult path, financially very difficult, and but I became very passionate about along the way because I realized it was my way to kind of have an impact on our society, to let these other voices be heard, to tell stories, help get stories told on film that might not have been otherwise told, because I became a producer, and to be a producer means you have to raise the money. If you can't raise the money, you can't have the power to tell the story you're making. So I realized pretty early on that manufacturing a movie wasn't enough, because it was raising the money that was going to, and from sources that were going to let you make the picture that you or your director wanted to make. That was the only way to be independent. And so that's where I went, what I did.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a long road, but I have to say now I'm financially I'm in as bad shape. None of this has ever paid off financially, but restoring films, saving the films we've made is even more gratifying to me now than making a new film, because I can save so many. It used to take us 3 or 4 years to get a movie made, and now I can help revive maybe 5 or 10 movies in a single year. So I feel, and as you get older, as you all know, time's running out, and you want to maximize your productivity on Earth as best you can. So it's become very, very gratifying for me to, let's say, get Jan's movie back out, an extraordinary movie, and to see it on a movie screen in beautiful 4K restoration, and know that it's going to have a new lease on life, and to do that for many, many other filmmakers is just so gratifying. But we need more supporters, so join the IndieCollect campaign. That's my little bit.
Oh, we will. I shouldn't interrupt. I just wanted to know if John Bailey's Search for Intelligent Science of Life in the Universe is streaming anywhere, so we could watch it as a group.
Well, I'm so glad you asked about that, because the search is going to be offered to theaters across the country. So you can't stream it yet, but it's going to be offered to theaters across the country on National Art House Theater Day, which is July 24. This is going to be a stunt with, we hope, theater, and Greg Lumley wants to play it that day, bring it back on July 24. So if you're in LA, you'll get to see it at the Lemley Monica on July 24. But I am in the process with Lily and Jane of negotiating a distribution deal for the film. And so, the people we're talking to would like to get the deal in place before July 24 so they can promote it. And then if that deal goes through with one of these companies, then yes, it will get a wider release, and eventually you will get to stream it or get a Blu-ray or DVD. So that's another success story that we're trying to make, build into a true success.
Say the name of the film again, please.
It's the Lily Tomlin film, The Search for Signs of Intelligent Life in the Universe.
I saw it on Broadway.
Yeah, I saw it too.
And
I was lucky enough to see it in Chicago. It was fabulous.
Yeah, we need a lot more intelligent life in the universe at the moment. So
Kidding.
it's the right time for this movie.
It was so relevant. I mean, when I saw it in December, and I had interviewed Lily and Jane when it first came out in New York for Newsday, where I was then working. So we had a
yeah.
I had a picture at the opening. They had a backdrop that looked like another planet, and somehow it fell out of my original book, and I think that was, well, shocking that I must be such a pack rat, but I did show it to anyway.
Well,
I'm really looking forward to.
Thank you. Yes, we'll do. I'd love to get the email.
And F asterisk CK the Army.
What?
And F asterisk CK the Army. The Jane Fonda.
Yes, the Jane Fonda film. Yes, FTA. That's another great project we did. Yeah. So, well,
Jill
we should
has her
probably
hand up.
wind up. Jill, you have a last question?
Okay. I thank you, Sandra. This has been wonderful, and I was very excited when I got the email that you were coming tonight. I love documentaries. I loved what you did. I loved your example about the bulldozer. I think if people were just more honest in that, and if you had the British or the US doing the bulldozing, as long as people say and honest about that, it's still the Nazis that put those bodies there. That situation occurred because of the Nazis. And as long as you're honest about it, I love that in documentaries. I love when they even put just little at the bottom, whether things are a dramatization, or if it's stock footage, or if it's real footage, just a little notation at the bottom really gives me some feeling, because I'm okay with stock footage. I'm okay with dramatizations. But, and I have to say that letter, when he's writing out that letter in what I would call European handwriting, I was like, ooh, that's interesting. So it's interesting that you pointed it out, which but we watched, I think a couple months ago, we watched a documentary on Robert McNamara, and I felt very conflicted because I couldn't tell which was actual footage and which was recreations. And I don't feel they were honest enough with us in that. And I'm like, all you gotta do is put at the bottom, and I'm happy as a clam because I'm okay with that kind of footage. I just want to know what's real and what's not real. My second point is I'm now planning my grandfather's funeral. He was 102. And I'm trying, and of course it's a military funeral, so I'm trying to impart on my niece why it's important that he went and fought in World War II. And I was surprised of her lack of knowledge of the Holocaust and the why of World War II. So I'm going to have to work on some more of that. But I do think that any kind of education that we can get out there. I mean, and she goes to an Illinois school where it's mandatory for this Holocaust education. Now, whether she really understands what the word Holocaust means may be I have a lot of talking to do and educating to do with her. But I do think that generation, our youngest, needs it pumped at them, because especially speaking out and saying no and saying there's a reason for justice, there's a reason for these things to be followed, And history does not need to repeat itself, especially on this one. I don't want it to. And so anything you can do to promote that, I would love to see. And I would read the book too.
Thank you. Well, you're encouraging me.
I mean, MG had the question that I did, and so I'm not going to repeat it, but I will say when the documentary started talking about, oh, he had an informant here and they went over there and they found that little map or whatever, I was like, ooh, I want to know that story. I want to know that little story too, and I hope that would be involved in a book. Thank you very much, and welcome all our guests tonight.
Thanks to everyone.
Sandra, we can't express our thanks, not simply for your time, but for the depth of the discussion that you've given us.
So rich.
It's just been so rich, so wonderful. I have had a question regarding, would you be willing to share your email address? And so we could send you some follow-ups.
Or IndieCollect, so we could send you some PayPal follow-ups.
It's just Sandra.Schulberg@IndieCollect.org. And maybe, Jan, maybe you could gather everybody's email and get it to me and share mine. That would be great.
I will be happy to do that.
That would be great.
I think it would be great if the members of the group got the emails that I get from IndieCollect about what you're doing, when I first.
I'd love to add all of you. And then you'll also hear about the screening of The Search, the Lily Tomlin movie. Yes. And we have other, we did this Rescue Fest in December. We're going to do it again. And it would be great if you came to see some of the movies. And we're doing some fun work. And also, if you know filmmakers who need a free inventory or need help restoring their work, please spread the word. We're trying to help as many filmmakers as we can.
Wonderful.
Sandra, just one more thing. When you talk to your distributor about getting into schools or whatever, mention all the Holocaust museums. I mean, this should be a regular in all the Holocaust museums.
I know. Yeah. I haven't been able to get, it's so frustrating. I know Sarah Bloomfield and a lot of the top people at the Holocaust Museum. We offered them the world premiere of this film. No response.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding.
I wish I'd been there. I wish I'd been there.
Our next door neighbor up downstairs, he works at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. So you can believe we'll be working on him to work out.
That would be great. I'd love to connect you to the people at Kino Lorber who handle educational distribution. I would love to make it, I don't know how good a job they are. It's been very frustrating, dealing with the Holocaust Museum.
It's amazing. I mean, there should be a corner where people can sit down and watch this film at
that would be the advantage of having it be an hour long too. I mean, it's easy to show in a class.
Easy. Yeah, it's an easy, not easy
they
to watch.
Can even come in a few minutes later.
Yeah.
Well, my memory of the Holocaust Museum was just all those little shoes, which doesn't really tell a story.
Yeah. Well, it does, but but this should be there. This should absolutely be there.
Yeah, it's been frustrating. So the more you can help, get this film seen by, it's hard for, I think, when I would be in theaters and would see, parents bring a 13-year-old in, I would stop. If I happen to be there, I would say, do you know what you're bringing this child to see? And invariably they would say, yes, we've educated our children. They know what to expect. But I think because of the depravity of some of which is reflected on screen, it's it's really 10th, 11th, 12th graders, not I think you have to give parents a say in what they want, how much torture and emaciation and you want your kids to see, because some of these images, I mean, I know even showing it to older audiences, it's amazing how many people have not seen some of these images and they're just devastated, so I know how disturbing the film can be, both the films can be, even though there's much less of that in Filmmakers for the Prosecution. So it's got to be handled carefully, but I do think it's important for older high school kids and college kids to see these films. I really do.
Well, and I will tell you, the Illinois Holocaust Museum within the past year did an exhibit on genocide. I mean, and Penny went with Alexis, a group of us, Rebecca, and yeah, and I did some research when I thought I might be pitching your movie as if I were pitching to Hollywood, and I looked at Enemies of the People, the Cambodian journalist, and his got an Academy Award for the Best Documentary Feature in 2012. Five Broken Cameras, the Israeli-Palestinian.
I love that film. I spent time with the director
of the Five Broken Cameras.
Five Broken Cameras. Yeah, I really think that's a very illuminating film.
And I noted that City of Ghosts highlights the Syrian issues. And that premiered at the 2017 Sundance Film Festival. You were mentioning that. And it then was acquired by Amazon for a $2 million deal.
Wow.
Yeah. My Neighbor, My Killer, 2009. That was Rwanda, about the 94 genocide.
Yeah.
And it was an official selection at Cannes. So, yeah, part of my homework was getting ready, like what else is out there, as well as, of course, from dramas, The Monuments Men we mentioned in Schindler's List and Judgment of Nuremberg, The Killing Fields, that got a lot of attention, maybe not we're talking about museums now. And then just in 2023, The Zone of Interest.
Yeah,
won 2
that's
Oscars.
effective film, I think. Yeah.
You are in the company, of some really important films.
Yeah, I've been approached about making a fiction film based on my father's, based on my work and my father and uncle's work. And I have very mixed feelings about this. Bertrand Tavernier saw the film. And I was a friend of my office in Paris was in his office. So I really, really admired Bertrand, and he expressed interest, but he died about 3 months later, so that wasn't. And then Jan has expressed interest, Kimberly Pierce, Alexander Payne, Jean-Christophe himself wants to make a fiction film based on the documentary and all my papers, but it's very hard to do this well. It's very, very hard to do this well. I thought The Monuments Men was just kind of a mess.
Yep, absolutely.
Very inaccurate.
Our group discussed it. It didn't have it wasn't half as compelling as yours. It didn't, it missed depth and personal.
Very hard.
But the other thing, looking at audience and who, and when you're marketing it, the interest in the PBS show, the Roots, the Finding Your Roots with Henry Louise Gates, I think that's another indication that the public, and that's what your story is, aside from the huge international background and the Nazism. You are a daughter who had this fantastic story in your family, and the letters and the photos and the film sitting there. So this is a root story, I think, as well.
It just landed on me. You know, I didn't set out to do this, but it landed on me, and I just felt a responsibility to understand the material and then try to share it with people. So I've really done I've tried to do it in a way. I've tried to do it with integrity, and I think I'd rather put my energy into the book than a movie. Maybe maybe the movie will be made after my death, but I know from the hour-long documentary, you know, so that we had to sacrifice so much, and we had to make it entertaining, and those pressures are quintupled when you're making an expensive feature film, which is so much more expensive. So I think with a book, a literary work, you have much more freedom to convey the nuances and get your ideas across and the facts. So that's my preference at the
Have you started it?
I wish you would find a middleman who could speak for you to the filmmaking, because think about the story you've told, Filmmakers for the Prosecution. To me, a highlight is the power of cinema as a tool for justice and accountability.
Oh, that's true. That's at the heart of
your heritage is cinema. So I salute you for doing a book, man. I have been postponing a book that I've got outlined and ready to go. And it's such hard work, and you just have to do it. But man, if their middleman could take all these goods and somehow...
You know, there's a perfect example of a very good book. I think it's called An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented... Neil Gabler's book, yes. Yeah. And then you go to the museum and you see that
it's awful. It's so awful. It's an anti-Semitic movie. I mean, it's really upsetting.
Well, the exhibit is just, it's so truncated, it's so superficial that epitomizes, you know, the strength of a book versus trying to find a more sort of public-facing expression of it. And it's just a travesty what they did. It's a travesty, and with the best intentions in the world, you know.
Teeny little corner where you can't even sit and watch it. I mean, if it were in a large, if the film were larger and had the perspective of the outsiders, I mean, it was very frustrating for me to watch. And it was very frustrating because I had to stand.
Yeah, several of us here were with the Illinois State Library and have librarians in our family. So I will say the power of a book has always been known. And it lasts forever and doesn't have to be restored. So there's that.
It has to be reprinted now and then, but yeah.
It also gives the reader the opportunity to embellish what the words were from the writer. In a movie, you don't get that. You get what somebody decided it should look like.
Well, will you write the book with an I voice as your journey of discovery or your father's? I mean, it's going to be hard to organize. I'm speaking as an editor now.
I don't know. There's a new book out that the author decided I've got to order the book. The author decided it's about the she started trying to tell the story of the Jews who were became part of the project to settle in Galveston, Texas. And she wound up discovering that her great-grandfather was a close associate of Theodore Herzl and was part of the thinking about what could there be a homeland for Jews somewhere in the world. And she started out telling it, if you've read the reviews, she planned to tell a kind of classic biography, or somewhat autobiographical, but have her own voice reflected in it. And then little by little, she took herself out of it completely, and she constructed the narrative solely with the documents. And of course, I'm so tempted to do that because the documents I have are so compelling. The letters are not only so beautifully written and so evocative, but the documents themselves are full of drama and conflict, and I was very inspired reading in the last week the reviews of her book, which I'm going to order because maybe I could, do that instead now that she's getting all this acclaim for having created in a way a new, I mean, it's a little bit like Talmud, you put so that appeals to me too. Anyway, I have to read it and make up my own mind, but it sounds, I can't even remember the title of it, but I think you'll all know of it if it's been much written about in the last 10 days.
Do you know Nora Luke's graphic novel Belonging? She's a visual artist, but it's a narrative of her search. She's that younger generation of Germans, and she finds out what her grandparents and great uncle did during the war. It's very powerful visually, and her style is very powerful. There's a lot of George Gross in it, and Timothy Snyder chose her to do an illustrated edition of On Tyranny, which is really worth it.
Wow, that's
I lashed my students to their chairs, and we went through that one page by page.
All right, I'm going to give Robert the last word because you had your hand up. Robert, did you?
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I had a power outage earlier, so hope I'm not repeating myself. This is actually kind of a side note about Jan because there are a number of Springfield people here in Illinois, and I wanted to mention that Jan was a writer and involved with Manhunt, which was the series about the Lincoln assassination and the search for John Wilkes Booth.
I saw that. Yeah. Exciting.
So I just wanted to mention that.
Great. I didn't realize the connection. Yeah. Jan was very excited. The other Jan, very excited about that. And I was at the premiere in New York, and it was great. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of us from the land of Lincoln. So.
Oh, yeah. I guess it's coming through to me that you're not all in Los Angeles. A number of you are in Illinois, right?
No.
Arizona.
Chicago.
Arizona. Oh, okay. Well, then we have to get
and
the
in
film
Austin, Texas, and
you're all over the place. Okay. Well, I won't necessarily be seeing you at the Monica Theater in that case, but hopefully we'll stay in touch.
4th, I'll be there, I think.
Great.
I'll be there.
Thank you again. This has been wonderful for all of us.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
Okay.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Good night.
Bravo.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. The rest of us can stay on for a few minutes.
I'm not ready to go.
I want us to do.
I am going to.
I need to go soon. Let's do our business quickly.
She was very good.
Yeah.
Generous with her time.
Fascinating.